Chapter 4, verses 16 and 25 is what we have before us today. It finishes off the chapter here in Romans. We've subdivided this particular chapter down to 3 specific lessons, of course, in the previous 2, that have really been traversing the explanation that St. Paul is giving regarding justification, especially and particularly centered around the archetypal Old Testament example, and an epicenter of this being Abraham himself. Okay, verses 1 to 8, where we covered 2 lessons ago, is really the answering the what behind the justification of Abraham. In other words, he is justified by what is it that he is justified by? Is it the various different commands that come afterwards? Is it Moses? Well, of course not, because he's afterwards. By what means was Abraham justified? Namely, picking up on that climactic part of chapter 3, the righteous is justified by faith apart from works of the law, okay, as it relates to Abraham. So verses 1 to 8 is by what means was Abraham justified? The answer being by faith apart from works of the law. He then deliberates upon how that is the case. How is it, therefore, that Abraham was justified by faith apart from the works of the law, when, of course, there are all these elements of the law that come from Abraham's time onward, especially through Moses later on. That is the discourse of verses 9 through 15, which is what we covered in the previous lesson. Okay? It is answering the how. How is it that he was justified by faith apart from works of the law? And the answer to which was that he was justified prior to the sign of the covenant being given. Okay? Today's lesson that finishes off the chapter is answering perhaps the only meaningful W that is left in this regard, which is the why. Why is it that he needed to be justified by faith apart from works of the law prior to those works of the law, right? Or even prior to, in this case, the covenant sign of circumcision in the old covenant, right? So the why is obviously delving specifically and particularly into the reasoning behind all of the things that he's been explaining. Okay, they've been more functional. Okay, what is it that he was justified by? How was he then justified by that thing, namely faith? Okay, this is the teleological explanation. In other words, the explanation of the purpose behind what has already been written thus far throughout this chapter. Okay. So we'll read through the passage and then proceed from there. Romans chapter 4, verses 16 to 25. For this reason, it is by faith, in order that it may be according to grace, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the seed, not only to those who are of the law, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, a father of many nations I have made you, in the presence of him in whom he believed, even God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. In hope against hope he believed, so that he might become a father of many nations according to that which has been spoken, so shall your seed be. And without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but rather grew strong in faith, giving glory unto God, and being fully assured that what God had promised he was able to do. Therefore, it was also counted to him as righteousness. Now not for his sake only was it written that it was counted to him, but for our sake also, to whom it will be counted, as those who believe upon him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, he who was delivered over on account of our transgressions and was raised on account of our justification. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. Alrighty. So hopefully the wording that we even had read there should begin to illuminate as to the manner in which this is addressing the why behind these various questions that I was addressing earlier on in the introduction. Of course, we run headfirst into that in verse 16, which begins our passage this afternoon. For this reason, okay, in other words, what's been explained in last week's passage. For this reason, it is by faith, in order that it may be according to grace. Okay? So fortunately here, Paul does not bury the lead, right? He comes out the gate with the fundamental statement, the thesis statements, we might say, and then deliberates and explains how or why that's the case. Okay? The reasoning as to why it, in referring to justification, the reason why Abraham was justified by faith according to faith apart from the works of the law, prior to anything, including even the covenant sign itself, the circumcision, was that in order that that justification, may be by grace. In other words, not human effort. Okay? It is in order that, just as this very same apostle goes on to explain to the Ephesians, okay, in chapter 2 specifically, verses 8 through 10, as you've heard me quote many times and will once again for the final time here. For it is by grace that you have been saved through faith. And that is not of yourself, right? It doesn't come from you. It is the gift of God. It is not of works, in other words, a result of works, lest anyone should boast, right? Because you would have reason to. You'd be like the Pharisee in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector that we referenced in weeks gone by. Okay? The fundamental reason that God is giving as to why he has orchestrated the arc of redemptive history in such a fashion, why this is the plan, in other words, is in order that he would get all the rightful glory and that we would not. Okay? That it would not be dependent upon the ever-varying levels of human power or human intellect or human wealth or human resources, human access, logistics, all manner of factors and categories and details that could conceivably impact or alter or otherwise determine these kinds of things. Okay? The kind of things that the Pharisees did indeed believe gave them the kind of guaranteed assurance that they held to, of course erroneously, in that they were the ones who were of greater intellectual prowess than their fellow peers, right? They were, in a general sense, smarter, right? That's true. They were certainly more educated, okay? That's obviously true. They had a greater, or at least were meant to, have a greater functional working knowledge of the Bible than certainly any of the disciples as they were at that point, right? The peasant fishermen and the carpenters and other such peoples, right? Even slightly educated ones like Matthew, of course, being a tax collector, right? So he at least had mathematical education, even if it was at the lay level, right? All these kinds of things. Of course, the way in which that kind of education is impacted deeply and profoundly by a variety of factors, least of all being geolocation and wealth, okay? Let alone other things that are within degrees of control, such as opportunity and accessibility and various other things, right? I can stand around and hypothetically boast in my own intellect for whatever it's worth, which is only by virtue of the fact that I was fortunate enough to be talented enough to go to very selective elite schools in Sydney, without which I would not have the intellectual academic background that I do. So in reality, to compare myself to others who have not had that accessibility of education or other such things is at best unfair, and at worst deeply prideful and hubristic, which is why I try and avoid it like the plague. Because all those factors impact one's own development of skill and talent in almost any regard. This could go for any field, right? In the case of something that's far more important than just merely what do you know, and how smart are you or not, or what's your academic qualifications in XYZ field, whatever it happens to be, or your business or your work, whatever. In things that pertain to the eternal salvation of your immortal soul, which does rank a little bit higher than those things, thankfully, God, in his infinite wisdom, has taken that out of human hands and placed it entirely in his own. Okay. Which is why some of the, even before, and this is often the primary focus here, although it definitely is a part of the focus of the book of Romans for sure. So touching on it here will not be the first time that we'll be doing so. It's the reason why any kind of theological or usually emotional pushback on what we call in Christian terminology the doctrines of grace, in other words, the reality that it is by God's grace sufficiently that we are saved, that we even have faith in itself. The pushback that exists in any particular regard fails to understand the problem that this is actually overcoming, right? The problem with taking this out of the purview of God's grace as the direct source and fountain of our salvation is that you are inevitably putting it into the hands of us as people who are finite, who are mortal, who are flawed, who are fallen, who are incomplete, who are broken, who are sinful, who are inconsistent, who wax and wane in all manifold ways, right? You are taking it directly out of the state of objectivity, God himself, and into an utterly subjective realm, right? Where theoretically, and we are only speaking theoretically because this is, thank God, not the case, where theoretically the clergy are a superclass of Christian, theoretically, right? And that is a problem that developed at certain points in church history, right? Not universally, right? But certain problems, and those problems got resolved, right? That's just the nature of how human beings work. Because you did end up with scenarios, like in the late Middle Ages, particularly in certain parts of Europe, not all, but certain parts of Europe, where the only people who had any meaningful education on various subjects pertaining to theology were, of course, the clergy. So the fact that the clergy knew infinitely more than their congregants was just a natural consequence of those circumstances. Not even necessarily to their own fault, really. It's not as if the individual clergyman was intentionally doing something wrong. It was just merely a product of circumstance. When you had mandated that Latin is the only language that can be used in the liturgy, well, you run headfirst into the problem with the fact that the only people who can thereby run the thing are those who know Latin, and the only people who know the Latin are the clergy, okay? As opposed to the native tongue, which is how it was conducted in the first 1,000 years of the church, right? For obvious reasons. So all these kinds of things. And the consequences and the follow-on effects of the fact that if the whole thing is being conducted in Latin, then now the people who don't know Latin don't understand what's going on, except for things, of course, you naturally pick up, like the average congregant, though a peasant farmer was not a complete idiot, they knew that when they heard the words, Pater Noster, qui es in caelis, that's the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, right? Our Father who art in heaven, okay? But the rest of it was entirely confined to those who were speaking the Latin, which was the only language that was allowed, in broad effect at least. And now you reduce the participation of those who can't speak the Latin, which would be everyone else. And so now the entire liturgy is being performed by the priestly or the priestly class, and none of the congregants are actually participating in anything at all. And so you just develop problem after problem after problem after problem, right? That needs to be reformed, ergo the Reformation of the 16th century. That itself is a microcosm of what this dynamic is avoiding, okay? The fact that in this case, as he said, the reason that it is by faith is that it is in order that it might be by grace. Okay, for this reason, it is by faith in order that it may be according to grace, because the faith itself is but an extension of God's grace. Okay, that's what he says in Ephesians 2, right? So that even in that faith, there is no personal boasting of, well, I'm right with God because I've trusted him and that's on me, right? I did that thing. No. God called you, and this is going to become more obvious when you get to chapter 8, where he gives what we in theological terms call the golden chain of redemption, right? It's basically this macroscopic 30,000-foot view of the actual chain or process of how God redeems and saves us from beginning to end, okay? That begins entirely before our justification with God actually having predetermined the course of our lives and having chosen us and then having called us and all these various things. We'll get onto that chapter, okay? that only work with God's active role or participation, for lack of a better term. Okay, that is what he is hearkening to. Okay, and it is not only or merely for God's own divine glory. Okay, that on top of that, there is an actual pragmatic reason as well. Okay, so there is both an abstract and concrete reason. Okay, there is all of which is spiritual, obviously, but an abstract and a concrete, or we might just simply say a heavenly reason and an earthly reason. Okay, one that pertains directly to God and one that pertains directly to us. Right, both at the same time. For this reason, it is by faith, in order that it may be according to grace, so that the promise will be guaranteed to all the seed, in other words, all the descendant. Okay? And then he clarifies what he means by that. Not only to those who are of the law, i.e. the Jews, but also to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all, he writes to the church of the Romans. Okay? So he's just explained, this is, and then quotes what he's referring to specifically in verse 17, so I don't bury the lead, right? As it is written, quote, "A father of many nations I have made you." Okay? Now that was already true in Abraham's day, ancestrally or genetically anyway, because of course he has Isaac and he has Ishmael and he has 6 other sons, right? Who then themselves, of course, through descendancy become the Israelites. They become, in the case of Esau, his through Esau, the Edomites, right? So on and so forth. Okay, so Abraham was the tribal ancestor of a variety of ancient Near Eastern nations, right? The Israelites, the Edomites, so on and so forth. Okay, that's just in the material, the physical sense, right? The biological, ancestral sense. Okay, which is true, but he's referring to something beyond just that. Okay, he is referring, because he's incorporating the concept of faith, he's referring to spiritually. Okay, so Abraham is the spiritual father, as we might otherwise say, of many nations, not just the ancient Israelites, right? Or at this time period known as the Jews, okay, the Judeans. It is not only them, and we throughout most of church history, this would not have been a point worthy of making because it just would be fairly self-evident. But it is unfortunately a point that has to be restated almost, as things tend to be at times where as different ideas and different doctrines and different teachings come and go and wax and wane across the period of history. Even ancient and fundamental truths at times have to be reasserted in different ages, right? In our case here, this particular statement is just, you can't, one cannot afford to just merely overlook it as if it were obvious, although it should be. Which is the direct, blunt description at the end of verse 16, that Abraham is the father of us all, as he is writing as a Jew to Romans. Obviously in the Church of Rome, there is a Jewish cohort and a Roman cohort, okay? And saying that Abraham is the father of us all. Do you understand? Okay, including the Latins, right? The Romans. Because in the particular eschatological system that we generally refer to as dispensationalism or as Christian Zionism, that has prevailed in many circles in the last 150 years, that is a concept that is fundamentally rejected and denied. Okay, I don't like that that's the case, and I don't like even necessarily having to point out the contradictory point, but it is one that I never really have to do in fairness. Okay, the fundamental belief that Abraham only belongs to ethnic Jews is a point that is directly refuted in these words. Okay, directly. It's not the only place he does this. He's going to do this again in chapter 9, okay, in an even more astonishingly obvious way, where he says, and we'll cover what that means when we get there, not all those who are descended from Israel, as in Jacob, belong to Jacob, belong to Israel, right? And then he has the audacity, quote unquote, to then actually start talking about who's a real Jew and who's not, which would get your life destroyed if you attempted to even try and speak that way today, okay, in certain circles at least, right? What he is very clearly directing our attention toward is the fact that in the New Covenant, the ethnic descendancy is not is not the delineating factor as to covenant membership. Okay, it's not. In so much and to such a degree that physical descendancy from XYZ, in this case Abraham, is actually bearing of no standing whatsoever. So the fact that not Pharisees anymore, but your fellow Pharisees, if you understand what I'm saying, of Paul, the fact that they are descended from Abraham means nothing in the ultimate sense, okay? It means something in the fact that they are the ones who have had all the law and the tradition and everything handed down to them, which actually only stands to make them more responsible because they should have known better, right? We actually covered, he made this point, not me, forget me. He made this point back in the last chapter, okay? And the chapter before that, technically, as well, right? He made this point in previous chapters about responsibilities, right? Specifically and particularly at the end, I believe, of the last chapter or of chapter 2, whichever one it was. I'm pretty sure it was actually the end of, it was the end of chapter 2 he made this point directly, okay? The patriarchate of Abraham, right, which is a fancy way of saying his, the fatherhood in this sense, is a spiritual one and is of many nations, because as he's directly reminding you and I and they, Abraham was told by God that he would be the father of many nations, not just one. So to confine or consign Abraham's patriarchhood to merely one nation, ethnic Israelites or Jews, makes no sense, even of what was said to Abraham in the first place, let alone what is being said here. Okay? It's not an attempt to be controversial, it's not even an attempt to be unnecessarily argumentative. It is merely directing our attention to what is so very clearly and plainly said. Okay? The entire purpose as to why he was justified, especially because how central this is. Remember, the whole point of this portion of chapter 3 is explaining the why. Here's the purpose behind why all this is the case. It is so that he would be the father of many nations. What that means necessarily is that to, as I said, confine or consign Abraham's fatherhood or patriarchate to merely the Israelites or the Jews, at whatever time period you're referring to them, is to fundamentally deny the salvation of the new covenant. By consequence, because his whole point here is that the reason, ultimately, as to why Abraham was justified by faith, apart from works of the law, before the circumcision, is that so that he would be the father of many nations. In other words, if that didn't happen, and if, like we talked about in the hypothetical sense in the last lesson, chapters 15, where he's justified, and 17, where he is circumcised in Genesis, if that was hypothetically flipped, this couldn't happen. And salvation could only be for the Israelites, the Jews specifically, okay? As they're called by this time period, okay? The reason why I'm ping-ponging between terms is because we're connecting back to historic terms. Obviously, Abraham was not an Israelite in that sense, right? The Israelites are named after his grandson, okay? Right, Jacob, okay? He was a Hebrew in that sense. He was a descendant of Eber, which is where the term Hebrew comes from, okay? Later on, they get called Israelites, obviously after Jacob, who's renamed Israel, right? He who wrestles with God. And then eventually, by the time the northern kingdom is wiped out, only Judah and Benjamin are left in the land. Okay, so they just simply become the Judeans or the Jews, as we simply call them. Right? That's a whole different discussion from what that looks like today, 2,000 years ago, because there's even further development along those lines, right? Obviously, Abraham was not Ashkenazi. He was not Sephardic. He was not Hasidic, right? All those European admixtures that have happened in the last 2,000 years obviously didn't happen to him, right? But in this particular instance, the purposefulness behind this is so that he would be, to conclude, the father of many nations. That he would become the spiritual father, the spiritual ancestor in that sense, of Jews and Greeks and Egyptians and Romans and Celts and Germanics and Persians and Babylonians and Ethiopians, and as we spread forth even around through today, of West African tribes, of Southern African tribes, of Aboriginals, of the Maori, of the various different Pacific nations, of the Chinese, the Japanese, the Korean, pick who you want, right? Doesn't matter. I'm talking all over the shop. Okay? He's the spiritual father of all of these nations in Christ. Okay? Because, as we've already explained this dynamic, especially in the entire book of Galatians, which we went through, but even in this book of Romans here, the seed, i.e. the descendant, the capital D descendant of Abraham is Christ. All those who are in Christ are therefore in Abraham. That's the nexus. Okay, cool. That is the spiritual metaphysic behind, or through which I should say probably, why this is said. Okay. As he continues on, as it is written, verse 17, the father of many nations I have made you, in the presence of him whom he believed, even God, in other words, namely God, who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. What he's meaning by that is he's talking about this aspect of promise, right? Giving life to the dead, okay, which is about to go on and explain what he means by that in regard to dead in a second, but calls into being that which does not exist, has a double meaning in relation to Abraham, okay? Part of which is obviously going to be explained as we work our way through the next kind of 2-3 verses here, up to verse 20 or so, right? In no particular order, firstly, giving life to the dead and calling it to being that which does not exist speaks of the promised child, right? Isaac. Okay? Giving life to the dead refers to the dead, meaning in this case the analogy being barren, right? Referring to his wife, Sarah, right? They're elderly, right? Very elderly. Beyond any natural years of childbirth, right? And calling it to being that which does not exist, okay? The child. Because the entire narrative of Abraham is premised, and the whole narrative keeps moving along, not even just the narrative in the literal sense of the narrative in Genesis, but the entire arc of Abraham's life is being fueled and propelled by the promise that this child will be born. And don't worry, it'll happen, don't worry, it'll happen, don't worry, it'll happen for, 40 years? I forget the number off the top of my head. 40 years of promise, if I recall correctly. 20 years, 40 years, I've completely drawn a blank. Yep, 40. Promise for decades nonetheless. Thank you, drawing a blank. But decades of promise of how long this would be, and then eventually, of course, it comes into being, and it happens, right? That is the fuel behind this, right? So the reason why he's saying this is on that note. It is also on the note of the greater and much more grand scope of the promise of this unmatched legacy, spiritual legacy, which is just referred to, right? The father of many nations I shall make you, right? God tells Abraham to go out in the night and to look up into the heavens and try and count the stars if you even can, right? Your descendants shall be as innumerable as the stars in the heavens, okay? Elsewhere they shall be as incalculable as the sands upon the shore, okay? Right? This gigantic plethora of people who will look back upon you as the beginning, as the progenitor of this great work, right? That I'm going to do through you, right? Speaking as God, okay? That's what's being referred to. So giving life to the dead takes on an even deeper meaning of giving spiritual life to those who are dead spiritually, dead in our trespasses and in our sins, as Paul, will go on to use the very wording of later in this book. Calling into being that which does not exist yet is, of course, this great multitude, which literally does not exist yet, because they, and by they, what that actually means is we, are thousands of years into the future. So calling into being that which does not exist yet even applies to every one of us who are sitting in this room 4,000 years after the fact. Right? So this is Paul basically ad-libbing here, by the way. So this is Paul speaking of he who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. He himself is the fulfillment of that, because literally anyone after Abraham is the fulfillment of that in terms of the Christian faith, right? But he knows that this is a transcendent reality that, as I say, transcends across time, through history, by God himself, or through God himself. So everyone coming after Paul, as he writes this in the 1st century AD, as we call it, is also the fulfillment of this, right? So Paul himself sits at this very unique axis for us, right? Not for any other Christians throughout history, but for us specifically, sits at this unique axis where the distance between us and Paul and Abraham is equidistant. Right? So Paul is living 2,000 years after Abraham. We are living 2,000 years after Paul. Right? And Paul is writing this literally at the center point of the history between this ancient patriarch, Abraham, and us. Right? Which puts into perspective something, almost beyond description. Right? It's a fascinating reality to ponder. Of course, which you could do to the nth degree, naturally. But he begins to then explain why he has talked about that, why he's referring to God as he who gives life to the dead and calls into being that which does not exist. Okay? Verse 18, in hope, against hope, he, referring to Abraham, believed. Right? So what he means by that, in hope against hope, in other words, what we might say is against all odds. Okay? So in hope against hope, or simply put, being hopeful in a hopeless situation, okay, he believed, which is the true mark of genuine belief, right? Belief, trust, confidence, faith are relatively, in the literal sense of relatively, right, comparatively easier, in fact in some cases markedly easier, if and or when things are concrete, certain, settled, established, predictable, so on and so forth, right? Ergo, Christ's own words, you have seen, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed, right? The faith that the apostles exercised, and Paul actually and Peter technically allude to this. In fact, actually, technically, Christ directly alludes to this, and just indirectly. He actually directly states this about mighty works being done in those days, but you will do greater works than these. That's often confused to mean like the miraculous things. But without being smart, we know that that's not the case, apart from the fact that you don't get much more miraculous than rising from the dead, right? That's not what's being spoken of in the context of that passage in the Gospels. He's talking in the context of faith. That's actually the natural flow of the discourse when he says those words, right? All these things that are happening here, this whole journey we're on through these 3 years, well, God in the flesh is literally standing before you, talking to you, right? You're watching with your own eyes someone who's been blind for their entire life all of a sudden start seeing again. You're watching a man who you grew up with as a child who has been lame and paralyzed get up and take his mat and walk home, right? You're watching, in the middle of this violent storm, this ghost-like spectre come walking out on the waters, only to realize that it's your master, right? You're seeing all this, right? Which is what makes the denial of Peter that much more shocking. But alas, that's all part of the purpose of the story. It's there for a reason. And dare I say this, although without being smart, the apostles themselves would say this because they insinuate this anyway in their epistles, especially Paul. How much more remarkable is much in alignment with this sentiment of in hope against hope he believed. How much more remarkable is the simple faith of the everyday common man or woman or child who lives a normal, simple life in their setting, especially if you think historically, in their little hamlet, in their little village, in their little whatever, whose life is WHO wholly unremarkable and entirely unnoteworthy to such a degree that beyond any living relatives, their name will be forgotten like the other 99.99% of human beings that have ever lived, and yet grows up hearing the truth and the tradition handed down to them by their parents and believes it and trusts that that is true, right? That's actually the meaningful essence of childlike faith, right? Notice that we never render that as childish faith, okay? Because that's an entirely different concept, right? There's nothing infantile about the Christian faith. In fact, it's the opposite. Childlikeness is speaking to the necessity of trusting, because children, by nature, need to trust the adults. They need to trust their parents, right, or their teachers, or whatever the context is, right? There is a necessary dynamic of trust that, as a child, you have to exercise, okay? Which is why, of course, the corruption and perversion of that trust is such a horror, right? And such an almost incomparable evil. Okay? That's what childlikeness is referring to. It's referring to the philosophical element to it, right? Not this kind of infantilized childishness that one could otherwise conceptualize, right? There is potentially even greater strength and power in the simple faith of everyday folk, yourselves now, anyone else in the future, anyone else beyond, beforehand, it doesn't matter, I'm just at any time period, that doesn't have 147 different academic qualifications and doesn't have all this rigorous depth of knowledge and doesn't have this remarkable elocution of speech and rhetoric and so on and so forth. But that just genuinely has a kind of hearty trust that God is who he says he is and that he has done what he has said he has done. And that is, and that God knows infinitely more than you and I, and that there is no higher source in which we can trust, right? That is what is being spoken of, right? It's not a blind faith. It's not blind faith at all. And it's not childish. But it is actually quite a strong faith in hoping against hope, right? Because in that sense, the tradition handed down, if you were cynical, and that's only if you were cynical, but if you were cynical, as of course people today do tend to be, you could view that, hypothetically at least, as essentially this kind of barbarian-like, unsophisticated type of view where you just simply, take it on the word of the culture you happen to live in and the adults, and as you grow up as a child, swearing on a stack of pinkies that this is true, and just take it at face value and never ever question it, right? That would be the cynical way, in my opinion, of viewing faith. Instead, genuinely trusting in that which has been revealed and that which the Spirit of God has been working in you for things which did, yes, happen thousands of years ago, but also are still actually happening, because the same God who is active in the things that we read of and in the historical accounts and the stories that we peruse is also the very same God who still does 10,000 different things for you before you've even got out of bed that morning. Okay? In ways that are so universal, quite literally, that we often just glaze by them without even noticing them faintly. Right? Hoping against hope is the context in which he believed, and that is the source of the strength of what's being identified and alluded to here. Is that true faith comes in the face of trial and challenge and conflict and adversity and difficulty, where odds are so stacked against you in one form or another, personally or collectively or whatever the context is, that it is the very environment and microcosm in which the true power of God can then flourish. Okay? That motif, in the specific sense especially of hoping against hope, is a motif which then plays out countless times throughout the history of the scriptures. Okay? Which, again, many of which will I'm sure, probably be obvious to you. It is in hope against hope that Moses raised his staff in front of the Red Sea as they were trapped on a beachhead with cliffs to the north and cliffs to the south and a very narrow, dried riverbed that they had been traversing their way across the Sinai Peninsula with the most powerful army in the history of the world hot on their heels, with horses, cavalry, chariots, and everything else in between, right? It is in hope against hope that when God told him to command the seas, right, that something would happen and we wouldn't all just get slaughtered or driven back into the sea and drowned, right? And that all of these things that have happened and the entire calamity, which this apocalyptic like calamity which has descended upon our world, would not be for naught, right? It's the definition of hoping against hope. Okay? As they are wandering through the wilderness, even in the aftermath of all that, right? Parched, starved, traversing, facing all manifold dangers from armies to wild beasts to the barrenness of the deserts, so on and so forth, rebellions and strife and continual conflict within the camp, to then eventually alight upon the promised land, even to the point where, though he had been chastised for his own fault and his own arrogance at one point, Moses was still granted the grace of being taken up on top of a mountain by God and overlooking the promised land, right? And so he could see the hope of the future, right? And I like to obviously naturally envision that scene. Of course, he would be looking westward, right there on the eastern side of the Jordan River, as occurring at sunset, right? Where the sun is shining over the land, right? There's this futurized aspect to it. The Israelites, the armies of Israel under Joshua and others, marching around Jericho, or the various other battles that take place, are grossly and vastly outnumbered all the way down, of course, through to the climactic engagement and single combat between David and Goliath is the definition of hoping against hope. Right? All these things that happen over and over and over and over again. The major prophets, especially like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who had the fortunate misfortune of living through the ending of their world in the form of the Babylonian conquest of Judea, okay, and the annihilation of the city that David built, Jerusalem, the massacring of their loved ones and their families and their friends, the enslavement of some back into Egypt, and the carrying on of essentially the aristocracy, more or less, into Babylon, right, into captivity. All on the proverbial divine pinky promise that it would only be for a set time period and that it would eventually end. With no meaningful ability, of course, to confirm that within your own life, other than trusting that God is telling the truth. Okay? Hoping against hope. The reason why this theme is so central to the scriptures, and therefore and thereby fundamental, quite literally fundamental to the Christian religion, is because it not only demonstrates, but it actually facilitates the exact dynamic that verse 16, the beginning of it, is proclaiming. For this reason, it is by faith, in order that it may be according to grace. In other words, God's grace. Okay? In other words, God will accomplish it, not you. Okay? Because as self-evident as it might be, right, having a pep rally outside one of the most ancient cities in the history of the world, Jericho, right, and showing off how good your horn section is, doesn't actually cause 3 layers of the most fortified city in the history of the world, of the ancient world, to collapse. Okay? God collapsed the walls, right? Them blowing trumpets did not materially, physically cause a 3-layered wall structure of one of the most defended cities in the ancient world to crumble. Okay? God did that through their obedience. Okay? They had instructions to do as part of the warfare, and then God would act. Okay? Hoping against hope, right? All these various things, right? in a general sense, and again, I'm speaking in general sense, there is, generally speaking, in earthly terms, no world in which a 14, 15, 16-year-old shepherd with very little, comparatively speaking, military experience, not no combat experience, right? He's a shepherd. He does have to fight off animals, including in those times wolves and bears, and even actually that far back, lions in parts of the ancient Near Eastern world, right? So he has experience killing and defending, right? So it's not no combat experience, but he has no military experience, David, right? He's not a warrior. He's not a general. He's not a commander, right? Generally speaking, there is no world in which that young man at that stature defeats a champion warrior, right? Which means something particular other than the fact that he was really good. That means he is the guy who this nation sends out for the ancient custom of champion combat, okay? Which has been a long-standing tradition in military warfare of sparing husbands, fathers, and sons from unnecessary slaughter on a battlefield that can otherwise be resolved by sending out your best warrior. Right? Our guy fights your guy, and whoever wins, wins, and we all accept the result because we're warriors and we have honour. Right? Especially not when you're talking about slinging a pebble, not really a pebble, more like a stone in reality, at a man clad in very archetypal late Bronze Age, ancient Near Eastern, in this case more like Greek armour, right? Because that's what the Philistines were. They were ultimately migrants descended from Greek peoples. There is no world in which you win that, if not for God, okay? So this concept of hoping against hope by faith and then ultimately prevailing is central to the Christian dynamic. Fundamental, really fundamental, okay? Because what it does is it takes the power and the glory that subsequently out of human hands and keeps it in God's hands. And the erroneous way would be thinking of that, I'm not saying you are, I'm saying the erroneous way would be to think of that as selfish, somehow on God's part. But it's actually not. It's actually the selfless thing. Because what it does is it's not actually for the purpose of self-glorification, although God is, of course, entirely rightful to self-glorify because he is God, right? That's a whole other subject. It is actually because God is not so careless as to leave this in human hands. That's actually the reason. Thankfully, he hasn't just left it up to us, because if he did, we would fail. And it is only through hubris and arrogance and pride and self-righteousness, the same that got us into trouble in the first place, that would cause you to think otherwise. You see the point that I'm making? Okay. God has not left this up to us, right? Because theoretically, and it is only theoretical, theoretically, he could have done that, right? Theoretically, he turns around and says, you got yourself into this mess, get yourself out of this mess, right? Hypothetically, okay? But he didn't, okay? As soon as we got ourselves into the mess, he made a slew of promises as to how he was going to fix the scenario that we had gotten ourselves into, right, in Genesis 3. Okay, that's what I'm referring to. That just repeats and replays itself over and over and over again throughout the history of the world. That's what it is. It's actually God being so loving of us and so caring of us and so selfless in that desire of love and care that he knows to not just leave it up to us. Okay? Because we would not succeed. Right? One of the most fundamental reasons as to why we would, generally speaking, not succeed, if it were left up to us, is because we're not the only players on the chessboard. Right? The other players on the chessboard, like the opposing team, only happen to be incomparably and unfathomably powerful demons. Okay? Right? Corrupt, dark, unspeakably evil, divine powers, right? Divine meaning heaven in this case, lowercase d, angelic powers, who can reap consequences upon us that are beyond our comprehension, to such a degree that they can entirely shape the cultures of whole peoples, which is exactly what ancient paganism was in the first place. Okay? Which can lead an entire civilization of people down such a dark and twisted path that they have convinced themselves that the only way that the sun will come up next year is if we kill 50,000 of our own people on a giant temple by ripping their hearts out and offering it to the big blazing ball in the sky, like the Aztecs, right, in Central America. Or that the only way that the green plants will sprout out of the ground next year and we won't starve to death is if we kill and sacrifice and offer to Baal our firstborn child. Completely warping and misconstruing and completely utterly forgetting the fact that if you just keep killing off your own children, there is going to be no future in the first place. Right? All these things, okay? All these things. That's the powers that we as human beings are up against. Powers that in our own right we cannot overcome because we're not the only players on the field, right? The battlefield is more than just human beings, right? When David is fighting Goliath, he's not just fighting Goliath, he's fighting the gods of Philistia, who are working in and through and by the Philistine army, who have devoted themselves culturally in servitude to these deities, to these lowercase g gods, right? To these powers. They've made themselves subservient. They have made themselves slaves of these divine beings, right? Of these angels, these demons in this case. Okay? So he's not just fighting Goliath. Okay? That is why God has not left this up to us. It's one of those reasons. Apart from our own fault and frailty. Because as soon as we did fall, we had now made ourselves subservient to these powers. Because the whole dynamic in the garden, you've heard me teach on this before, obviously, but just to briefly recap it, is that apart from the particularized sins of what is literally going on, the broad, general, transcendent sin is the inversion of the created order. Okay? God creates man, from the man he creates woman, and he places the angels as servants of God unto mankind. Okay? In the case of Satan's own fall, that's where he has been sent to. In this case, it is now an angelic power dictating and twisting the woman, who then leads her husband in rebellion against God. It's the complete inversion of the chain, back to front, right? That's what's going on, metaphysically. It's the inversion of the created order, okay? So now we're subject, in ancient times, to that end of the spectrum and not this one, by our own hand, right? That's why, go ahead, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I've just been reading about Mount Jericho.
Yep.
And God just tells him to go and kill all these people.
Yeah.
And you can't help thinking.
Yeah.
You know, how do you do that? Why do you do that?
Why?
You've heard that
Yes.
they're all evil and
Yeah.
stuff, but
No, yeah, why? It's a great question. I'll save it till the end for I'll answer that in the response part. It's a great question. No, because there is an answer to that does require nuance and parsing out why that's the case in the specific instances in which that happens. Because actually, a number of cases, most cases, he tells them not to do that. But ones that there are instances like Jericho where he does tell them to. The great question, which I'll be able to answer at the end. Right? Good question. So, hoping against hope. To finalise, what actually I ended up referencing yesterday, interestingly enough, what J.R.R. Tolkien in his work, The Lord of the Rings, right, as one of the great, now these days, great pieces of English literature, certainly the last century, speaks of as fighting the long defeat, right? This hopeless scenario where the forces of evil grow and manifest in such rampant and widespread ways that the armies that they prevail coming out of the evil place of Mordor are so gargantuan and so horrific and so terrifying in these creatures, the orcs, right? These twisted, malevolent creatures so consumed with evil, right? It's a picture of what evil is. That as they assault against the fortified cities of men, the odds are literally insurmountable, right? this image of fighting against what seems like a long drawn out process of decline and defeat is the motif that Scripture explicitly repeats over and over again by virtue of God directly and purposefully using that dynamic to actually save us. Okay? All of these things, the great climax of which, of course, is the actual advent and life and death and resurrection of Christ himself, where at the time in history when the most powerful empire the world had ever known had now alighted upon the world, it had conquered all of the Mediterranean world, or at least, right, the Western world as we would call it in ancient times, right, had established itself as the power by which all powers are compared. Its capital is the center of the world as far as the people consider it. Its armies are invincible and unconquerable to such a degree that on the odd chance that they ever lose, it's world-breaking news, right? Like at Teutoburg Forest, for example, in 9 AD, right? And its ruler, its monarch, right? Not that they considered it a monarch, but what it was in effect a monarch, its emperor, its Caesar, is only known as the literal Son of God. Same actual divine title that was playing out in the East, in the Huangdi, the Chinese emperors, right? The Son of Heaven. This is the time that Daniel had foretold, had spoken of, the great apocalyptic end of the ages, right? All these kinds of things. And then the Messiah comes and he lives, and then he's strung up, literally and figuratively, right? On trumped up charges, and he is crucified and killed, and all hell rejoices, and the disciples are utterly shattered because they still haven't got by this point that death is actually part of the plan, and they're in shambles and disarray because somehow the powers of darkness working through the Jews and the Romans, by extension I suppose, managed to kill the Christ. It couldn't possibly be more over than it is right at this moment on Saturday, right? It's done. All of this, the whole thing going back through the prophets to David and to Moses and to Abraham, this was all for nothing because he's dead now. He's dead. They won. Like we've totally lost, like completely lost. God has lost. Right? That is the essence of exactly what that atmosphere is attempting to communicate purposefully. Right? That's why it speaks of them in such. They're separated, they're broken up, they're hiding out in Jerusalem. Right? It's purposefully designed in the Gospels to communicate the fact that they are in total disarray and shambles. Right? That should be fairly obvious when you read that. But then, of course, Sunday morning comes. Okay? And as the ancient words foretold, right? The Son of Righteousness, right, dawns once more. Okay, as Isaiah foretold in chapter 9, which is why we begin every single Advent, the beginning of the Christian year, with that specific passage. The reason why we do that, apart from the fact that's the tradition, the reason why the tradition is that case as to why Isaiah 9 is so central to Advent and especially the first week of it, is because the entire prophecy of Isaiah 9 begins by God through Isaiah promising that upon the land of darkness light will once more shine. That those who dwell in the shadow of death, upon them light has shone. Okay? Zebulun and Naphtali is the ones that are in specific references. They were the northernmost territorial places of ancient Israel, and they were the first ones conquered by the Assyrians, right? The Assyrian Empire. They were the ones that were on the borderlands of the dark pagan world around Israel, right? That's the whole concept, okay? Upon the land of darkness. And so that motif of the land of darkness, the shadow of death, as you're familiar with perhaps from places like Psalm 23 that get repeated in Isaiah 9, right? The valley of the shadow of death, the low, dark place, as opposed to the light shining on top of a mountain, right? The valley of the shadow of death. Valley of the shadow of death, pardon me. Upon that land, light has now dawned, okay? And so the light breaking through at the dawn, and of course even the way that has been purposefully created into the very astronomical function of the earth and of the world, right? that the night quite literally is at its darkest at that 3-4 a.m. time, right before the dawn, right? It's not darkest around midnight. The night goes dark, 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 dark until boom, dawn, right? The break of dawn. Okay, so that's being designed that way very intentionally. Okay, even the time, of course, in which the Christ comes. Okay, in that he is born in the latter parts of the year, and yes, December is actually the most likely time in which he was born, contra other opinions, right? But that's an opinion nonetheless. We have manifold reasons for believing that dating was actually accurate and that our ancestors 1,500 years ago were not complete morons. Well, that's occurring right around keeping in mind in the Northern Hemisphere, what would be, in the Northern Hemisphere obviously, the winter solstice, which is the time period in which the days are their shortest, i.e. the nights are their longest, i.e. the days are at their darkest. And from that time onward, all the way through to what in the north would be the spring equinox, right around the time when Easter happens, the days get longer and longer and longer until the spring equinox, when new life springs forth, hence its name, from the death of winter. Or did you just think that these events were orchestrated at those times by mere coincidence? Right? No. Okay? The sun, the moon, and the stars were all given for what explicit reason in Genesis? For the marking of times and seasons. Okay? The very story of redemption is actually baked into the entire cosmic order of the planet and of the heavens. Okay? That whole image of darkness reaching its greatest prevalence and extent only for then light to break through at the 11th hour, proverbially speaking, is the motif that God uses, because when things are that dark and hopeless, we are doomed if heaven doesn't intervene. Meaning that who does the glory for the victory go to, ultimately? God, not us. Hoping against hope, he believed in countless ways. From the journey, speaking of Abraham, the journey itself, an arduous, over 1,000 kilometre journey, right? Hope narrowly following along the Euphrates River, right? Traversing across the ancient King's Highway, the deserts, all this kind of stuff, to this land you've never seen before. This land has only been promised to you and spoken of in whispers by travelers and merchants alike, right? All the things and events that occurred, this promise of the child, it's going to come, it's going to come, it's going to come, it's going to happen, right? Decades of time going through, even to when that child comes. And of course, the greatest archetype of this concept of hoping against hope would be what in Abraham's life, do you think? Not quite the birth. Any other ideas? Does relate to Isaac, though. The sacrifice. So you know this promised child that you guys waited for decades that eventually by all miraculous accounts came? Yeah, here's what I want you to do. You're going to take him up on a mountain and kill him. Sorry? I'm going to do what now? You're just going to kill him. Yeah. So if you just take him up on that mountain, see that mountain there? We're going to take up on that mountain, right? If you just take that knife that you have and just kill him for me, that'd be great. Right? Makes no sense. It makes no sense. It's so completely counterintuitive and paradoxical to everything that God has said for literally decades in this guy's life up to this point. It is the most nonsensical thing that you could ever even envision being said to you at that, if you're putting yourself in Abraham's shoes, right? After all this miraculous birth, this whole box and dice, literally everything that's happened along all these lines and blah, 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 and then now God tells you to turn around, and by the way, kill him. It makes no sense. Except it actually does make sense if you just let the story play out. Because then, as he's really going to go through with it, right, of course after an incredible struggle, right, he eventually resolves to go, well, I've rolled the proverbial dice in my head about a dozen times in my life, and every time has landed on God actually being correct. These are pretty good odds. I'm probably just going to roll the dice again and see how it goes. Because that's all you have left at that point if you're Abraham. I'm speaking somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but you get the picture, right? God has pulled through every single time without fail up to this point, including even literally miraculous things, right? Like the birth itself of the child, okay? Which is not literally impossible, right? But 80-odd women, as a general rule of thumb, don't have children, okay? It requires that kind of divine intervention, right? God did that. And so God has pulled through for you if you're sitting in Abraham's shoes every single time, including the survival. Again, everything by this point you're talking about, and you've got this happening, you've got that happening, you've got of course, the rest of the things in regards to Lot being saved from Sodom and Gomorrah, and the armies and the battles and all these kinds of things, the War of the Five Kings, all these kinds of things that go on in this guy's life. And he resolves that God must have, and this is where the rubber hits the road in terms of the faith, which is why the operative faith is in hope against hope, he believed, is that in that event of the sacrifice, right, of Isaac, or the would-be, I guess in this case, would-be sacrifice of Isaac, is that he really does actually draw the conclusion to follow through on it, without which the story doesn't happen, right? He really does, in his head, resolve, I'm going to go through with this for real, and somehow, I have no idea how, but somehow God is going to do something from this, through this, by this, because of this, I don't know what. So he really genuinely did believe that God actually had the best intentions for Abraham and for his own son. And of course, right as he's about to actually follow through on it, stop. Right? And then there is a ram caught in the thicket, a thorn bush, which is a purposeful hearkening back to the garden. And sacrificial lamb in the thorn bush, all this imagery. It's a direct Christological archetype, right? And then the sacrifice is made, boom, and the rest is history. That's what in hope against hope he believed truly means. That's why I spent so much time on it here, okay? Because this otherwise simple and pithy and short clause in the beginning of verse 18 is absolutely foundational and essential to the Christian religion. It's why, no matter what we face in society today, to conclude this point on this particular clause here, all we are doing is living through one of a countless stream of archetypes, or in this case, the archetype, replaying itself over and over again, right? Because if I were to genuinely sit here and start to try and elaborate in greater depth and profundity the immeasurable and incalculable odds that modern Christians are up against, it would just, at some point, you would eventually beg me to stop, right? We are dealing with powers that are supranational, like transnational by nature. They bear no loyalty to any individual group of people or nation or tribe or tongue or kindred whatsoever, other than one very particular one in the Middle East. They have infinite wealth and power by comparative measures, not literally, but also actually in a sense they do quite literally have infinite powers and wealth by virtue of the economy that has been purposefully built for this scenario, driven entirely by credit, which by nature is the infinite creation of what otherwise might as well be monopoly money. Okay? The ability to move and transact and to travel with speeds and distances that those in times past could never possibly conceive of, through flight, right? Through private jets, through all these kinds of things, right? The ability to communicate like that from one side of the planet to the other with these very devices that sit before us, right? All these kinds of things. The ability to coordinate, the ability to exert power to degrees that's terrifying through the very agencies and organizations that they have created, especially through national intelligence organizations and agencies, with abilities to know and to purvey and to delve and to spy upon anything and anyone that is deemed a threat or a target of any kind of useful acquisition. All of these kinds of things that prevail against the church at the highest of levels among a people who, as we well know from recent leaks of documents in the last year, traffic in children, rape them, torture them, eat them, and kill them, through referencing things like the Epstein files. Okay? All in the service of quite literally Baal and Satan, whom they directly identify as serving, specifically by name. Okay? That is the power of the international hyper-elite class, for lack of a better term, that is attempting to annihilate and destroy the church once and for all in their own mind. Right? And the systems and the cultures that we have been born and raised into have been created overwhelmingly for and directed unto that purpose of achieving those objectives. I'm not speaking about things that are purely speculative. I'm speaking about things that actually have concrete basis, right? The other speculative things I leave for speculation. Right? I'm talking about the things that are concrete, the things that are public, the things that are demonstrable, right, or evidence. Okay? That might be the very definition of against all odds. Okay? To degrees that Christians have never had to deal with. No, Christians have never had to deal with this scale and scope of internationalist, globalistic power that forces of darkness now bear, okay, and possess and hold. The only possible way that can even faintly dream of being survived, let alone defeated, is by divine intervention. There is not one single thing that you and I individually, barely let alone collectively, can even hope to do against that, okay? And when I say collectively against that, I mean ourselves in our own right, in our own power, right? You and your families and your children, your grandchildren, whatever it is, right? It is only through the intervention of heaven that we can ever hope to see something vaguely resembling a worthy future for our descendants. Because there is just such an infinite list of metrics and categories upon which we are, by purely human eyes, completely screwed and doomed. Okay? And that's not pessimism. In fact, it's actually the opposite, right? Accurately describing and articulating the battle space, it does not constitute pessimism, right? That doesn't constitute pessimism, okay? It's actually an optimism that by rightly identifying what you're fighting in front of, what you're standing in front of, you can then hope to then start to work against that by the grace and power of God, right? That's the purpose for me, illuminating and explaining it that way, right? Where the words "in hope against hope he believed" become so immeasurably meaningful to us, not just things that happened thousands of years ago, where the only way that we will see a brighter day for our descendants in this land or in any other land for any Christians around the world is if, in hope against hope, we believe. And namely in God. That if in hope, against all odds, against odds that no one in the history of the world has ever faced up until this point, which is true, right? Certainly on an absolute scale, probably also even on a relative scale, that if we trust in the God of Abraham, then we, like he, will prevail. Moving through the rest of the context of what we have, right, because the rest flows fairly naturally, right? That's why we spent the bulk of our time in the beginning of verse 18 here. The context, as it flows through from verse 18, in hope against hope he believed, so that he might become a father of many nations according to that which had been spoken, quote, so shall your seed be. Okay? Obviously part of the hoping against hope. And without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, right? And the deadness of Sarah's womb, right? That hits home for some more than others.
1 foot in the grave.
Sure, that's another way I might as well say it, right? But notice that he did so without becoming weak in faith, right? So as the Psalms would more poetically put it, he did not grow faint in heart. Do you understand what I mean? Right? His faith did not waver after decades and decades of promises from God that this would happen, and not seeing literally and figuratively the fruit thereof. Okay? He did not waver, right? In other words, without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, right, the state of his own life, now as good as dead since he was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. Yet, in other words, in spite of that, with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith. So not only did, what he's saying is, in other words, not only did the faith not waver, the faith actually grew. So it didn't even just remain the same, it actually grew. Abraham's faith got stronger, right, more robust, more battle-hardened, we might say, over the course of his life than it was, of course, prior thereto, right? Which again is part of that dynamic of in hope against hope he believed, because that seems counterintuitive. Things are not panning out in purely human temporal terms, in the finite limitations of our own minds where we can't see the future. This seems like this is not actually going to plan, right? Across all kinds of things. Of course, the events that transpire in the close call that happens in Egypt, Lot getting kidnapped. Lot and the army guys originally getting kidnapped, getting rescued. Lot then getting stranded in, stranded of his own accord, admittedly, but stranded nonetheless in Sodom and Gomorrah, right? That whole ordeal, right? All these kinds of things, right? There's 1,000 different things going wrong across this time period, right? The war of the 5 kings, this great ancient war that happened, right, between many of the powerful tribal kings of the ancient Near East, right, that prevails around that. Abraham's kind of sucked into that, just in the orbit of it all, right, all these kinds of things, right. Through all that, his faith didn't waver, and not only did it not waver into unbelief, it actually grew stronger, right, giving glory to God and being fully assured that what God had promised, he was also able to do. Right? So in other words, this God who appeared to him and spoke to him all the way back in the land of Ur, in the ancient land of the Sumerians, right, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, as they were known, that this God was not just, without sounding blasphemous, full of it. Okay? This wasn't just words, but these were actions that backed up the words. Okay? Because that is contrary to the way that many of the ancient gods do at times, in fact, quite often at times, behave, right? This varied across different pantheons, of course, depending on which culture you're talking about. But if you would talk about, for example, the Greeks, I mean, they're filled with duplicity. You wouldn't trust them as far as you could throw them. They constantly lied. The whole charade of, well, of course, it's very Greek, isn't it? The whole thing is so theatrical, and very eccentric personalities, and very emotional and very heated, and very expressive and colourful, as the Mediterraneans tend to be anyway, and would lie, cheat, steal their way toward whatever particular outcome they were otherwise desiring, and they would shape-shift and transform themselves to deceive and to trick and to manipulate and to even just for the sake of irony sometimes, and just basically cracking a laugh at how easy it was to fool this person, and blah 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 blah. A level of capriciousness that can hardly be contemplated and comprehended. But in the case of God, of the one true God, in the case of the God of Abraham, there's no trickery. There's no stupid games. There's no duplicitous sleight of hand. There's no hanging the fate of an entire person upon some double entendre that you used in some prophecy through an oracle somewhere. There's no gotcha moment. It's just things that just prevail in ancient pagan pantheons are the most eminently human stories that have ever been created, which of course is the entire point. Because the gods were often far more a reflection of the people than the people were of the gods in this satanic symbiotic relationship. When God says, it just simply is. There's no fluff. There's no trickery, no deception, no duplicity. God says this will be, and then in 5 minutes or in 500 years' time, either or, it happens. It just is. It happens. Every single time it happens. Like, this is why this is such a central portion of just Christian belief in terms of how do we actually believe anything that's actually written in this thing right here, is the fact that at the end of the day, no matter who you are, even if you're the most ardent atheist of the modern age, you still just have to eventually deal quite frankly, and give some answer to the fact that in some cases, like you're talking well over 1,000 years prior, specific things are said that this particular person will be born in this town, Bethlehem. That they will be born, even though it makes no sense at all, from a virgin. 700 plus years in advance of the thing happening, right? You have to just eventually face that head on and figure how on earth can that be said centuries, and in some of the longest cases millennia in advance, and then it happens. And it doesn't just happen in some secret. It's not like what usually happens in all kinds of different religions, especially some of the Eastern religions like Hinduism, which is basically just some guru descending from a mountain telling you all these new things with no verification of any of it at all, right? It's just here's some guy who just said some stuff, and then of course it just turns into an entire cult or religion. No, it's in front of hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of people, and to such a widespread degree that even his enemies don't deny it. Like all these kinds of things, right? That's what he's speaking of, Paul, when he's talking here in regard to, growing stronger in faith, giving glory to God, and being fully assured that what God has promised, he is also able to do. Because Abraham has already seen this God live up to his promises so far, and that is the basis upon which you trust that he will continue to do so. Right? So the fundamental reason for being Christian in the 21st century is ultimately the fact that we can look back on history and see all the things that can be demonstrated and evidenced to have occurred upon the word of God foretelling these things, and that it actually happening, and that to me is a pretty good basis for probably trusting that it's going to keep happening that way. Because I fail to see what the alternative is, right? Even if you just talked about it religiously, right? The alternative is what? Atheism? That like there's only a material nature or substance or essence to the cosmos. That how on earth do you begin to explain how all of these things have been said centuries in advance and then happen exactly how they were said? How? How can any of these people know that is exactly how it's going to play out? How can, even not just in the Christian sense, how can Isaiah foretell 150 years in advance that a great and mighty founding king called Kurosh, Cyrus, would arise by name? By name. How does he name the founding king of the Achaemenid Empire by name? Do you realize how many Persian names there are? All the names. And what? He just like flipped a coin and Cyrus? No. And that he would also be the founder, and that it would also happen at exactly the time period that it was foretold to happen, right? How? You can't do that. There's no human mortal way by which that can be done. It has to be divinely inspired. Right? Fully assured that what God had promised he was also able to do. That's the essence of it. And therefore, as he quotes once again, it was counted to him as righteousness. He trusted him. And so then verse 23, 4 and 5 to finish off. Now not for his sake only was it written that it was counted to him, but also for our sake, to whom it will be counted as those who believe upon him, God, who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. He who was delivered over on account of our transgressions and was raised on account of our justification. So let's break that down. Okay? This was not only for our sake, but as he's ultimately concluding, this is not only for his sake, but as he's ultimately concluding, it is for our sake also. Okay? It's for our sake, for we will be counted as righteous by faith, just like he was. Right? In other words, by trusting that this is the God who, against all hope, we should hope in. That whose word is actually sure and whose testimony is true, and that when he says thus, it actually is, or will be, right, whatever the context is. Okay? That fundamentally, the ultimate source in the great hierarchy of being that can ever hope to be trusted is, of course, the one who's at the very top of that chain. And that would be the Creator. Right? What higher source can there be to trust in than the very being which created the whole thing. Okay? That would just be a fairly rational thing in the first place, right? So ironically, the trust, in a sense, whilst the belief, the faith, whilst being against all odds, is actually still very, well, to use the direct term, logical, right? Why would again, even the ancient aphorisms that are used in the Psalms and the Proverbs and elsewhere, right? Trust not in the war horses and chariots, trust not in princes, right? No, as rulers, right? But trust in the Lord, okay? Obviously, there are actual temporal instances in which you need to trust the rulers and trust the army to do its job. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about ultimately who is your trust in? Well, God. Because why would you place your ultimate trust in a subordinate level of being? Why? That doesn't make sense. That would be a foolish thing to do, right? It's the fundamental crux, by the way, and flaw in atheism, things I mentioned it earlier, right? Is that ultimately the conclusion of atheism is to trust your own flawed, finite mental acuity and capabilities, right? Ultimately, that's what it is, right? That though you very clearly have not, as no human being ever has, you somehow still act as if you have searched every single possible piece of knowledge attainable in the entire universe and not found God, which of course you haven't done, right? No human being has even contemplated 1% of 1% of 1% of everything that is knowable, keeping in mind that the scope of what would technically be knowable is what the exact atmospheric pressure is on a planet in an entirely different galaxy, right? That would be what contained in the concept of knowledge, right? The knowledge, the actual scope of knowledge is incomprehensible of what actually functionally exists, okay? Even if we went to and jumped in our spaceship that doesn't exist yet, if it ever does, and went and travelled to our nearest star system, right? Like Alpha Centauri, right? Which would take an extremely long time or a very short time, depending on how good the technology was, I suppose. And we then went and had a look, and we then wanted to come to study what is the chemical and molecular makeup of the waters, hypothetically, that exist on one of the planets in the Alpha Centauri system. That would be knowledge. That's the scope of what we're talking about when we talk about all knowledge, right? And the conclusion that I know there is no God is contained and premised upon you having examined every single possible bit of knowledge, including what amoebas exist on insert planet. Because could not God be contained there somehow in your grand search for where God is? An amoeba, like a little microcosmic little microbe, right? Could God not be there? Right? Exactly, right? Because after all, you're out searching for where God is, and you're now claiming that you have thought through every possible thing that ever exists and have concluded that I have found no God anywhere, right? You can't. It's a logically absurd thing. I know this seems comical, but it's because it's logically absurd. That's why, fundamentally. Okay. So to circle back here, not only for Abraham's sake was this the case, or is this the case, but it is also for our sake that we are counted as righteous by faith, right? As ones, right, as those who believe upon him, the Father, who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. Because ultimately, none of us were there at the resurrection. We haven't seen the resurrection. We also haven't seen this guy called Jesus who was raised from the dead, in terms of, actually seen him. We are entirely trusting that ancient documents actually happen to be true. Now, of course, there's 10,000 reasons as to why they are trustworthy, which would be its own lesson in its own right. Okay, but we are trusting that, and the trust that we have is the same kind of trust, except it is, at least in terms of the salvation aspect of it, the orientation of Abraham's faith was futuristic. Okay, ours is preteristic, in other words, the past. Okay, we are looking back on things that have happened and trusting that it happened. It's a lot better than trusting things that have not yet happened, because there's no written records, there's no archaeology, there's no history, there's nothing. It hasn't happened yet, right? So we're in a much better position, right? Relatively speaking, it's a greater blessing, okay? And then finally, verse 25, to break that part down, he, referring to Christ, who was delivered on account of our transgressions and was raised on account of our justification. It's a very interesting way of phrasing that, and very useful and helpful, right? What does he mean by that? Simply and essentially put, dividing it into two clauses, obviously. Christ, who was delivered, in other words, delivered unto death, over on account of our transgressions, right? So he was put to death, he was delivered over to death on account, in other words, for the purpose of or because of our transgressions, our sins, okay? We generally tend to know that, right? The second one's a little bit more intriguing, and was raised on account of our justification. So he's talking about the death and the resurrection, okay? So he died, he was handed over to death, he willingly handed over himself, right? He submitted himself to death, as he so proclaimed, to Pontius Pilate, right? He was delivered over on account or for the purpose of our transgressions, in other words, to atone for our sins. That was the purpose. And he was then raised from the dead on account of, in other words, for the purpose of our justification. Okay? Because the entire consummation of our salvation is not only confined to the cross, it is also in the resurrection. Without the resurrection, as Paul says elsewhere in his writings, our faith is futile and in vain, and we are to be pitied more than any people in the world. Because we're the dullards and midwits and simpletons who are worshipping a dead God. Which is, I will admit, painfully ironic, because every single religion in the world is doing just exactly that. Right? In one form or another, is following a dead prophet. Right? And yes, that is purposefully ironic. Okay? Islam is fundamentally taking the word of an illiterate Arabian warlord. I'm saying that neutrally. That's an accurate description, right? Who died in exactly the manner that he himself said he would die in if he were a false prophet. Right? So Muhammad told his followers early on that if I'm a false prophet, God will cut my heart, right? And I'll die, in other words, of a heart attack. And that's exactly how he dies. He died. His dying words were, my heart has been cut. Right? His aorta severs and he has a heart attack. That's exactly how Muhammad dies. The Islamic sources says that's how Muhammad dies. Muhammad dies in exactly the way that Muhammad said Muhammad would die if Muhammad was a false prophet. An entire religion of 1.6 billion people has been spawned from the word of a guy who said that he would die that way if he were a false prophet.
Don't they realise that?
Look, the problem with asking me that question is it's way too tempting for a man in my position to just bombard you with infinite levels of sarcasm and irony, and give you the most sarcastic answer in the history of the world. Even though I'm not trying to be mean, do they realise that whilst invoking divine levels of restraint, the ones that do don't remain Muslim for very long. That's the absolute politest answer I can possibly give. So the average Muslim does not know that because they never get taught that. It's there, but just like most things, it's in the hadiths. It's in the kind of commentaries on the Quran and the other events of Islam. Basically, has the Quran, of course, penned by Muhammad through his scribe, and then a series of hadiths, as they're called, which are basically like filling in the blanks of all the other parts of Muhammad's life. It's a bit more complex than that. They're like commentaries on the Quran, effectively. And they range in how widely or not widely they're accepted by different Muslims. But many, robust, historically grounded ones, I won't bore you with the whole list, but like ones like Sahih Bukhari and Sahih al-Muslim, various sources that are basically agreed on by every Muslim, right? Those kinds of sources. Anyway, it's in the Islamic sources that are accepted that Muhammad dies of a heart attack in the exact manner that he said he would die, as the proof that he was a false prophet if he were one. And just everyone just kind of glazes over that detail. Again, you place on almost any single level, right? Buddhism is just basically the self-professed enlightenment of an aristocratic Indian prince who went off into the mountain for decades and came back with brand new teachings as a breakaway from the ancient Vedic religion, without doing anything meaningful to demonstrate why on earth anyone should believe him about anything. All the various different, I guess we'd call them denominations essentially of Hinduism, from Brahmanism to Krishnaism to Vishnuism to Shivism, all the various different devotions to the different parts of the tripartite deity in Hinduism, are all just at one point or another some Indian guru, usually from the Brahmin, or sorry, always from the Brahmin caste essentially, who, when they're not busy literally and figuratively spitting upon the untouchables that grovel at their feet in Indian culture, come up with some new way of devoting themselves to insert whichever deity you're talking about, and just because, like, what is it that actually gives us any reason for believing anything you say, right? I can do that. I can come up with some grand new religion and just simply decide that and gather unto myself some devotees, and we can just transform this Bible study right here into a new religion of insert whatever funny name I come up with. But why not should anyone believe me? Like, what have I done to demonstrate anything that gives you any reason for, yes, this is where I'll place my eternal hope. Yes, it's in your hands that I will leave my immortal soul and the fate thereof. That after death, things will work out fine. Why? That's the answer to that part. Right. So raised on account of our justification is by virtue of the fact that if Christ is dead, which he's not, there's an empty to prove that, then we're to be pitied, and Paul says that. Okay. Because without the resurrection, what's it all? There's no, what is it? Oh, this Jesus Christ came to conquer death. Well, it sounds like he got conquered by death, if he's just dead, right? Right? It's devastating what happens. I'm saying to you, there is no parallel to this, by the way. There's no other parallel. I mean, so cynical modern atheists will attempt to try and draw the loosest possible strings of connection between the resurrection of Christ and anything else that's along those lines. They just don't. They fall apart after about 2 minutes of examination or any kind of pushback or testing, right? The utterly unique dynamic of the resurrection of Christ, which is what he's obviously chosen to finish this entire point on, right? Raised on account of our justification, in other words, to make our justification real and possible, right? The resurrection is the linchpin, therefore, of the whole thing, okay? Even any concept like what he's been referring to here, like verse 21, being fully assured of what God has promised that he was also able to do. Well, Paul explicitly tells the Athenians in Acts chapter 17 that the way that God has demonstrated all the things that I've just got done talking to you about is by raising this Jesus Christ from the dead. Right? So Paul, the same author, explicitly tells the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers of Athens that the proof of everything that I've just been telling you about in this grand speech here in this historic city is he raised him from the dead. Right? Oh, yeah, true. He raised him from the dead. Okay? So that is the essence of it. Because if God can do that, well, just about everything should be fairly straightforward. Right? Because if he can bring this Jesus back from the dead, which is perhaps the ultimate act of power, even maybe potentially you could argue in some philosophical sense beyond creating the world, but they're at least in the same range as each other, right? Then everything else kind of just tends to fall beneath that, right? So if this God can do this, then he can definitely do this, right? Right? If a sprinter can run, if a sprinter can at the Olympics can break 10 seconds, they can definitely run 11, right? Because 11 is slower than 10, right? And so in something like 100 meter, for example, right? And so anything less than that is possible and doable, okay? That's the point of what he is of saying here, is that the assurance comes from the fact that all of these things have been done to prove and demonstrate once and for all time that God is true, and that what he has said is true, and that what he does is true, even for things that might still yet be future to us, like our own resurrection, which is, of course, the exact point, quite literally, that he makes in 1 Corinthians 15. That the reason why we can have, as in like literally us, can have hope as Christians, then or now, that death is not the end of our existence, is because he brought Jesus back from the dead. Okay, and if he can do that for him, what does that mean he can do for us? The same thing. Right. That's a fairly logical, straightforward idea, right? It doesn't take a rock science to figure that out. Right? That's the ultimate point. So, there we go.